This multinational diving team, American, Japanese, Micronesian, is preparing for a rendezvous with history. The place is Truk Atoll in the Caroline Islands, South Pacific. Exactly 30 years ago, it was the scene of one of the most massive air-sea battles of the Pacific War. Now, a generation after the killing stopped, these once mortal enemies have joined forces in a strange and inspiring venture. Together they will unlock the last remaining secret of that long-ago battle. The secret concerns the Shinohara, or more properly, the I-169. Once the pride of the Japanese Imperial Navy's submarine fleet. Now she lies somewhere on the bed of Truk Lagoon. Even by modern standards, the 169 was remarkable. 330 feet long, she could cruise at 23 knots on the surface and at 8 submerged, with a maximum range of 23,000 miles. She'd seen action at Pearl Harbor and been trapped for nearly 3 days in an anti-submarine net there before she escaped. Built in 1935, her armament consisted of 1 4-inch gun and 2 anti-aircraft machine guns. Her 8 torpedo tubes had accounted for a score of merchant ships. In 1944, she was based at Truk, preparing to carry supplies to besiege Japanese troops on Rabaul. The American air attack caught the Japanese supply fleet at dawn on April the 4th, 1944.
American naval forces gather for a knockout blow at Truk, the Japanese naval base in the South Pacific. Carrier planes warm up for a dawn attack that will avenge in full the treacherous assault on Pearl Harbor. Over 50 Japanese ships are sunk. 148 Japanese planes are destroyed in the air and on the ground.
Among the ships caught by that first dawn attack was the pride of the Japanese submarine fleet, the I-169. Along with 4 other anchored submarines, she dived at once to escape the fate of the surface ships all around her. At a depth of 160 feet, she should have been safe from bombing. Her crash dive ought to have been a matter of well-drilled routine, as this captured footage found by our researchers in US Naval Archives shows. But in the panic caused by the fury of the American air attack, someone failed to close a valve on the torpedo loading hatch. As the 169 dived deeper, the water flooded in. She'd escaped destruction on the surface, only to put herself in more deadly peril. It was too late to prevent the flooding in the torpedo section, but so far, the men aboard were safe. Watertight doors sealed off the flooded compartment. The crew moved aft to trim the boat as she settled. There seemed every chance of surfacing once the air attack was over, but the raids went on for 3 whole days. The carrier force refueled its planes as soon as they landed. There were some Japanese air attacks. But most of the Japanese bombers had already been destroyed on the ground. American air losses were small, though some badly wounded planes barely made it back to their carriers. Land-based four-engined Liberators took over the final destruction of Truk. When the three-day attack was over, what remained of the great base lay under a huge smoke pall. The few ships that escaped included all but one of the submarines that had dived for safety. When the surviving subs headed for the open sea, the I-169 was not among them. All salvage attempts had failed. The bodies of 13 of her crew were recovered, but 84 men died inside her. At Truk, where the rising sun of the Imperial Japanese Navy finally set, the sun rises today over a scene of beauty and peace. There's no clue to the fact that more than 80 war and supply ships lie beneath the 40-mile-long anchorage enclosed in the islands of the atoll. On the islands themselves, there is still plenty of evidence of the battle that took place there 30 years ago. The jungle has taken into its green arms coastal guns that never got a chance to speak in defense of Japan's greatest offshore naval base. Fighters and bombers caught on the ground that April day in 1944 need no commemorative garlands. The forest keeps perpetually green, the memory of the crews that fell under that lightning onslaught. Even the tropical creepers have not been entirely able to erase this metal scar. It marks the spot where American planes caught Truk's oil storage depot. Today, the Micronesian authorities, which administer the islands under the US supervision, look upon the wartime relics of Truk and its lagoon as a monument to one of man's greatest follies, but a folly that will, mankind hopes, never occur on quite such a scale again. The position of most Japanese wrecks, on the surface and beneath it, has been known and recorded for some time. Only one was absent from the roll call, the I-169. In 1973, a team of American divers, led by Al Giddings, went to Truk Lagoon to search for the 169. They knew that the Japanese government, who had no record of her exact location, had always hoped to discover where she lay. The American divers were all veterans. On the map of the lagoon, they had plotted the position of all known wartime wrecks. Paul Tsimoulis is editor of a skin diving magazine. Stan Berman, left, is a heart specialist when not diving. Jack Chappell markets equipment for skin divers. Ken Siebold, who knew most about the wrecks in the lagoon, was later to die tragically in a car crash. Using an echolocator, they first searched areas of the lagoon which they suspected had been overlooked. They identified known wrecks as they passed over them. So many Japanese ships lie on the bed of Truk Lagoon that it may truly be called the American Navy's final avenging of Pearl Harbor. The first major exploration was made on the Fujikawa Maru, a submarine supply ship that might give a clue to the 169's whereabouts. Al Giddings records that moment.
The Fujikawa sat upright on the seabed at 150 feet, so entry was fairly easy. A school of jacks shoaled inside a hatch. Paul Zamolis' light hesitates momentarily on a venomous lionfish near the bridge. 30 years had turned much of the Fujikawa into a coral reef, but we are surprised at how well preserved the remaining equipment is on her bridge. A dial that recorded helm orders spoke to the divers in Japanese characters that no eyes had seen since 1944. The pointer lay at 0. The Fujikawa was at anchor when the bombers found her. The engine room telegraph that never got a chance to ring for full speed ahead on that fatal morning. Now it and its engines are permanently stopped by the encroaching coral. The open mouths of the speaking tubes give the sunken bridge an eerie atmosphere, as if it had only recently been abandoned by the Fujikawa's last duty watch. Diving deeper, we enter the lower deck. A pile of propeller blades of the type used by the famous Japanese Zero fighters. The Fujikawa must have been ferrying supplies to the airfields on the different islands of the lagoon. At a depth of 135 feet, a high-pressure air storage system and compressor, part of the ship's diving equipment vital to the maintenance of her brood of submarines. A wheel on which the Japanese troops might once have hoped to roll to victory, although by 1944 it was more likely to have served them in retreat, as was the truck of which it was a part. What mechanic removed the hood, perhaps for the last maintenance check, before the vehicle went ashore? Now the engine lies revealed, astonishingly intact even to its distributor head and spark leads. Gas masks ready for instant use in racks. The cloud that rises around them is not lethal vapor, but silt disturbed by our passing. One deck down, perhaps in the bosun's stores, a spare ship's wheel. It would make a magnificent souvenir, but Micronesian law says that nothing in these wrecks is to be disturbed. To remove anything would be like rifling a tomb. At 160 feet, in the lowest hold of all, the most sinister discoveries, rack upon rack, crate upon crate of ammunition made extremely sensitive by the corrosive action of seawater. 8-inch shells, perhaps intended for a Japanese cruiser, with armor-piercing noses. They look menacing enough. But they're toys compared with what our torches reveal next. These enormous projectiles were intended for the 18-inch guns of two of the Imperial Navy's greatest battleships, the Yamato and Musashi. The copper driving bands at the base of the shells were designed to grip the rifling in the battleship's guns, and they're as good as new. Bombs spilled from their cases, one buried to its nose in the accumulated silt.
Fascinating though it was as a submerged war museum, the Fujikawa was not what the Americans had come to find. As leader of the expedition, Al Giddings decided they must seek clues ashore on the islands around the anchorage. Giddings had already offered a reward for information. On October the 21st, a Truckese inhabitant called Max reported to Dr. Berman that he knew of the Japanese submarine and that it had been anchored at the time of the attack. Berman questioned him closely. Soon a second informant, Kimyo Isaac, came forward. Their accounts made it seem likely that the 169 had made her last dive in the channel between the islands of Doublon and Pfeffan.
I think he died back in 1945.
When the war was finished, huh? Was he killed in the war?
They began to search the channel closely with the echo sounder. They took with them a Truckese called Captain Nedlick as pilot.
Around 8.
This is not the grave, that's just his monument.
Okay. On Bond, huh?
Tall.
Berman and Chappell stood by, waiting for the first indication from the depth sounder. When at last they got a reaction, it seemed surprisingly small, if it was the 169.
Go!
They dropped anchor and got ready to make a deep dive.
Make a... We can make a go.
At 130 feet, a shape emerged, at first sight remarkably like that of a submarine. The echo sounder hadn't lied. It was far too small to be the 169. They found a Mitsubishi bomber shot down by American planes. They kept up the search in the Doublon Channel for several days. Various echo traces brought disappointment, but at last they narrowed down the most likely area. Al Giddings, who filmed the search for the 169, takes up the story of the actual discovery.
We all knew the submarine would be large, but our first traverse along her port side was awesome. She seemed to disappear into infinity through the strange green haze at 160 feet. Long strands of wire coral grew from the hull. Otherwise, she was amazingly clean. Strangely enough, she had no conning tower. We discovered later that it had been blown up to destroy secret control equipment. Forward, on her starboard side, we made an amazing discovery. The hull was encircled with wire cables. The Japanese had evidently tried to lift her when her own crew's attempts to surface had failed. We found an air hose, too, intended to bring life to the trapped crew and perhaps to pump out her flooded compartment. Its rubber was nearly as sound as the day it was plugged in. I could imagine the exhausted crew inside listening to the thud of bombs that foiled all attempts to save them. They tapped out messages with a hammer on the inside of the hull. After 60 hours, we found out later, the messages faded and stopped altogether. Heat, lack of oxygen, and gases from spilled battery acid had made the I-169 a tomb for 84 men. We gathered round the aft torpedo room hatch. Now we'd found her. We had to plan the next dive so that we could get inside.
On their second dive to the sunken submarine, the divers took down winching gear. They had found that the main hatch had been released from the inside, probably when the crew thought there was still a chance of escape. External water pressure would have held the hatch shut until the crew had flooded the compartment inside. Over the years, the submarine had filled with water, and the hatch would be free to open, except that coral had grown all over it. This was where the winch came in. A first glimpse inside a tomb that had remained sealed for 3 decades. Once the hold of the coral had been broken, the hatch moved quite freely on its brass hinges. Al Giddings recalls that moment.
We'd arranged that the first man to venture inside would be Ken Siebold. Paul Zamola stood by to back him up. I was trying to picture for myself, I guess everyone was, what Ken might find once inside. Within seconds, he was 8 feet below us in the main engine room. The machinery was amazingly undamaged by its long immersion. A circular hatch led forward. Later, we'd have to go through there, though it looked extremely uninviting now. For the moment, there was more than enough to hypnotize us right here in the engine room. The master control panel of one of the main diesels. You could still read the dials through the glass. Engine temperature gauges. I couldn't understand why just one or two were missing. Then, the first sign of the crew, a solitary shoe. Our lights moved over the chaos of abandoned gear, searching for the remains of her dead. I-169's clock had stopped at 2 minutes to 8, probably long after time had run out for the men trapped aboard her. The gas mask the Japanese must have used when chlorine fumes began to seep through the boat. Then, what we knew we must find, some bones. Most of the bones were high on top of the engines, where the sailors would have found the last barely breathable air. As we had previously arranged, we neither moved nor removed a single thing. This, as events turned out, was the best decision we could possibly have made. I think we were all fairly stunned by what we had seen. We'd been 20 minutes inside the I-169, though it seemed more like 5. We shut the hatch. We'd already discussed our next move, to take the filmed evidence of our discovery and show it in Tokyo.
The divers still kept the exact location of the 169 in Truk Lagoon a secret. But it wasn't to be a secret for long. Once the Japanese Welfare Ministry had seen the film, they allotted a budget of 34 million yen to salvage the remains of the crew and bring them back to Japan. Work was to start the following summer. Next August, salvage vessels entered Truk Lagoon and anchored exactly over the 169's last resting place. If ever anything emphasized the futility of war, it was the composition of the joint American and Japanese diving and salvage teams. Peter Wilson, U.S. Director of Marine Resources in the area, is flanked by Miso Yoko of the Japanese Department of Health and Welfare. Gidding's diving team had been invited to share the operation with Japan's best professional divers for one reason only. When they found the 169, the Americans had treated the relics as sacred and disturbed not a single bone. For the Japanese, the recovery of the crew's remains had become almost a religious pilgrimage. Before diving began, there was a ceremonial sprinkling of sake upon the water. The ritual dive to recover the first relics is led by Taka, the Japanese team's #1 diver. From now on, every single item recovered from the 169 will be treated with the same reverence. Juan Sablan, district administrator, shares with Mr. Fuchada, head of Japan's leading salvage company, the honor of carrying the first human remains to the bridge of the landing craft.
Now the flowers.
Once the first ceremonial dive was completed, the American and Japanese teams worked in shifts to remove everything easily accessible inside the submarine. Now the hatch was roped back to avoid accidents. There was only room for one diver wearing air tanks to squeeze inside. Once inside, the divers took off their flippers to avoid stirring up the heavy layers of sediment. One of the Japanese team brings out a book of music. The top pages are rotted, but underneath the sheets are still intact. It was almost as if a magic preservative had been at work inside the submarine. Bag by bag, the former crew and their personal belongings return to the world of light and air. The divers return also. Working for long periods at 160 feet requires that they decompress on the way up, hanging with spare air cylinders from fixed lines as if pinned out against the surface. For several days, the relics continue to come aboard. A nameplate from a seaman's locker, the characters still legible on the unrotted wood. Not surprisingly, fantastic rumors had spread on shore about the salvage operation. One of the strongest was that the I-169 contained $1 million worth of gold bullion, instead of a pathetic collection of personal effects and human bones. So, to keep the record straight, every single thing taken out of her was logged and checked by the Micronesian authorities. If they were to escape the agony of the bends caused by absorbing nitrogen into the bloodstream, decompression became vital to all the diving teams. Each had its own member whose task was to work out how long every individual diver must stay below in order to remove the nitrogen from his system. Japanese and Micronesian each kept their own records of dive times. As a result, there was always a string of divers beneath the salvage boat waiting for the safe moment to ascend. This is the American diving team sweating out their turn to surface. Team changes places with team. Diver hands over to diver. What started out as a formal, correct relationship between Americans and Japanese had inevitably become a close, almost intimate working partnership, as if to bury as deep as the 169 the hates and enmities of a previous generation. Standard time to hang 10 feet down for decompression was 40 minutes. On one occasion, cameraman Al Giddings had worked at 160 feet for so long that he had to hang on the static line for 4 hours and 40 minutes before it was safe to surface. When everything easily removable had been taken out of the 169 by divers, the Fuchada salvage crew rigged the dredge. The dredge consists of a huge suction pipe that extends from the salvage vessel down into the interior of the submarine itself. The dredge works like a gigantic vacuum cleaner once the massive compressor has been started to give the sucking power. Water comes rushing up the pipe, bringing with it anything it snatches up inside the sub. Right away, items too small for the divers to have found buried amid the silt are caught in the sieve at the top of the dredge pipe. The collection on the bridge grows steadily. The prize relic, the 169's plaque inscribed in red with her name Shinohara after her last captain. Traditionally, the name of the boat is written on living material, wood, not metal. A 35mm camera made long before the day when Japan became the world's foremost camera manufacturer. Tibia and fibia and a button of the Imperial Japanese Navy. The helmsman's wheel brings the dead boat to life again. Captured footage shows how an identical wheel was used in the I-class boats. What music did the ship's gramophone play? A sake bottle and a belt buckle with the traditional fouled anchor. Juan Sablon, district administrator of Truk, checks the finds. Certainly there is no rumored store of gold here. Just the poignant belongings of 84 drowned submariners. A ship's bell is always the center of her daily routine. It's easy to imagine how that bell called the 169's crew to action stations. An electrical circuit diagram. Perhaps the engineers pored over this for alternative sources of power when the sub-services were failing. And now the book of sheet music has been carefully dried and opened. Its notes are still perfectly legible. Apparently it belonged to a member of the crew whose bamboo flute was found close by.
Must be crew member, huh?
Leather boots have fared less well at the hands of the sea. The submarine's fan is remarkably intact. Japanese film shows how it was mounted inside the 169. In those dark, trapped hours, the crew can hardly have squandered dwindling power on its use. Wives, girlfriends, pin-ups? Perhaps even today someone in Japan will recognize them. The bones have been reverently crated. A member of the salvage crew plays a last lament for them on a dead sailor's flute. A launch leaves for the mainland with the mortal remains of the I-169's 84 dead. "30 years after they first mourned their loss, the relatives of the 169's crew arrived to take their dead sons home to Japan. On a grey, wet day, the Japanese Welfare Ministry has flown them across the Pacific as part of this unique government-sponsored plan to recover the bones of naval dead from a sunken ship. Hundreds of thousands of Japanese dead lie buried on the scattered islands of the Pacific, but very few of them have been given the chance to rejoin the spirits of their ancestors back in their homeland. For some, it is an unbearably emotional day. For Mr. Yura, for instance, in his peaked naval cap, he is the 169's only survivor. That morning, he had gone ashore to fetch supplies. Mr. Markey was one of the salvage crew who tried to put lifting cables round the boat. He heard the last messages tapped out by the trapped crew. Now he has come to sound a last post over his comrades. All that remains of the 169's crew is garlanded with green boughs in preparation for cremation. A portion of the ashes will be taken back by each relative to their native land. Sake is sprinkled once again, and fire accomplishes what water could not. Our cameras were allowed to record this moment of private sorrow for the families of the crew. A mother weeps for her long-dead son, while a young girl relative holds a camera. But then she never knew the agony of victory and defeat. As the flames complete their work, two old comrades pay their last respects to the men of the I-169, the Shinohara. To the older relatives, it may seem incredible that two once bitter enemy nations can combine to bring the dead sailors back home. One can only hope that to the younger ones, it may seem even more incredible that those nations ever fought at all. And if that is the case, the salvage of the 169's lost crew will have been much more than an empty, heroic, or even sentimental gesture. Beneath the waters of Truk Lagoon, one last ceremony remains to be performed. The Japanese divers go down to the 169 for the last time. They are about to close her hatches forever. Now the corals that have so decoratively taken over the stay of her radio antenna will be left to complete the work of sealing her tight. The main hatch is lowered, to be battened down once and for all by welding. A second welding team completes the job at the very torpedo-loading hatch that apparently caused the disaster. The I-169 will not be disturbed again. She lies over 25 fathoms deep, a steel monument both to the courage of mankind and to the lunatic self-destructiveness of the human race.